My Life and Struggle, Autobiography of Badshah Khan, Pilgrimage to the Countryside. In 1912, my parents found a bride for me and my marriage took place. In 1913, my son Ghani was born. In those days, the people in our province did not know much about meetings and demonstrations, and even if the thought had occurred to anyone, nobody would have dared to organize either for the fear of the government. But one day in 1913, we saw big posters and announcements of the Muslim League meeting in Agra, which was to be presided over by Sir Ibrahim Rahmatullah. Sir Agha Khan and Maulana Abul Kalam Azad were also to take part in and address the meeting. I was very keen to attend this meeting. Along with a few friends, I went to Agra. We heard the presidential address and the lectures by Sir Agha Khan and Maulana Abul Kalam Azad. We found the meeting extremely interesting and instructive. From Agra, I went to Delhi, where I spent a few days with a nephew of Maulvi Fazlur Rahman. While I was there, I fell ill, so I returned home. In 1914, I received a letter from Sheikhul Hassan requesting me to go to Deoband immediately. Maulvi Fazl Muhammad, Maulvi Fazl Rabbi, and I left at once. In Deoband, we found the Maulvi Sahib of Degar waiting for us. We spent several hours discussing the question that was the uppermost in our mind, the freedom of India. We considered the possibility of opening a center from where we could work and start the struggle for independence. There had been a supposedly strong center of crusaders in the independent territories of Bonaire. In actual fact, these crusaders had no strength, and the people who ran the center were useless. They did not make any propaganda or did any work at all. They were only a small group. They used to receive money from India, with which they used to enjoy themselves. There was one rich man among them, one Naghmatullah. He was from our province. He was hand in glove with one of the top officers in the secret police, whose name was Short. There were, in fact, quite a few spies in this group. These people had originally come from the plains of India to fight against the Sikhs. After their leaders, Sayyid Ahmad Sahib and Sayyid Ismail Sahib Shaheed had lost their lives in the fight, the rest of them had gone to Bonaire and settled down in the independent district. When the people in India found out the true state of affairs and realized that these crusaders were of no use at all, it was felt that a new center should be established. After long discussions, we decided that I and Fazl Muhammad Sahib should go to Bajor and select a safe and suitable place to start a center. Maulvi Ubaidullah Sindhi was to come and inspect the place we selected and give his final approval. A few days later, Maulvi Fazl Muhammad and I secretly left for Bajor. We took the train at Takht Bai and got down at Dargai. From there, we took a tanga. When we reached the entrance of Malakand, we became a little worried, for we saw the police guards had been posted there. They were questioning and searching everyone, whether on foot or driving, and if there was a slightest suspicion on anyone, he was arrested. It was not easy to conceal my height and appearance, and sitting in the back of the tonga, I was nervously wondering how I would be able to pass the police unnoticed. All that I could do was wrap myself in my chadar, that is, a sheet of cloth. The tonga had to stop when we came to the police post, and one of the guards approached to see who was inside. It was evening and was getting dark. My companion had got down from the tonga. The tonga driver discreetly said, "Sir, there is nobody in the tonga." The guard, however, wanted to see for himself, and he approached the tonga. He looked me up and down and then told the tonga driver to go ahead. I was greatly relieved. We drove on as far as Bukht Khel, where we got down. It was very late by now, and we spent the night in the village. Very early the next morning, when the first call to prayer rang out over the village, we set out on our journey. We were crossing over the Chakdara bridge when we found that there was a police post there too, and we got past without any difficulty. Walked all day. In the evening, we came to the bank of the river. Fazl Muhammad's village was on the opposite bank. It was winter and the river was almost dry, so we were able to walk across and reach the village. We were very hungry and tired, and as soon as we had taken our food, we fell asleep and had a long night's rest, which was badly needed. The next day, Fazl Muhammad stayed behind to wait for Ubaidullah Sindhi, but he asked his cousin to accompany me. The two of us started for Bajor. We were now in the district of Dir. We first went to Babara and then to Chamarkand, where we went to the house of the Mullah Sahib of Ada, only to find out that he had passed away. But one of his sheikhs was there too, who was a very fine man. He showed us Ada Sahib's room and dining room. This was a very small but very beautiful place in the mountain, and nobody else lived there except for the sheikh. He had a small house and he kept honeybees too. We spent the night with the sheikh, and in the morning we took leave from him and went to Kotki. There were two Khans in Kotki, Zahravar Khan and Zirawar Khan. They were both very good men. Whenever the British made a raid, they took part in the counterattacks. From there, we went into Salarzai territory and then into Mohmand territory. These were two independent districts of Bajor. The people here were very fine Pakhtuns. Unlike the Pakhtun tribes, they had not been influenced by the British at all. Neither did they accept any money or allowances or grants from them. On the contrary, they always joined those who were fighting against the British. We visited almost every village in the whole of this territory. I like the village of Zagai in the Mohmand territory as a possible choice for our center. So we stayed there to wait for Maulana Ubaidullah Sindhi. We waited for a few days, but when he did not come, I began to fear that my presence there might arouse suspicion of the local people. So I decided to perform a chilla. A chilla is a meditation and prayer. There was a very small room in the mosque. I retired there and began the chilla. When I had completed it, there was still no sign of Ubaidullah, so we left. Fazl Muhammad's cousin came with me as far as Malakand, and there we took leave of each other. The political agent at Malakand had created such fear in the hearts of the people that even the most respected and self-respecting citizens trembled in their shoes when they encountered an Englishman. They used to salam and bow to the Britishers from a distance in a most humble and degrading manner. And if anyone became as bold as to pass the Englishman without greeting him, he would be arrested and put into stocks. Stocks is a large wooden frame with holes for the foot and a lid on top, in which an offender is locked up in a sitting position, his feet sticking out through the holes. Afraid that this fate might befall me, I left Malakand and went back to Dargai, took a train to Takhtbai, and from there I went to my agricultural farm in Nari village in Mohmand district, where I spent the night. The next day I returned to Usmanzai. The following morning, many people came to welcome me back. That was because before I left, I had told everybody that I was going to on a pilgrimage to the shrine of the great Sufi saint Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti at Ajmer. Not long after this First World War broke out in Europe, and we had to abandon our plans for a center. Sheikh Muhammadul Hassan went on Hajj to Makkah. There he was arrested and handed over to the British, who put him in prison in Malta because he was sympathetic to the Turkish Khilafat. Maulvi Ubaidullah Sindhi went to Afghanistan. Maulvi Saiful Rahman joined Haji Sahab of Turangzai, and both went to the independent district of Bonaire. Also with the Haji Sahab went my colleagues Taj Muhammad Sahib, who was the principal of Darul Ilm at Gadar, Maulvi Fazl-e-Rabbi, Maulvi Fazl Muhammad, and Maulvi Abdul Aziz. Maulvi Abdul Aziz was so hostile to the British that whenever he encountered a Britisher, he would close his eyes. The British plotted against him and had him killed at Sawat. A little later, I also secretly went to Bonair. The people of Bonair had given the Haji Sahab a beautiful plot of land, and they had even brought timber to build a house for him. But the mullahs and the elders in Bonair were not happy at the thought of Haji Sahab establishing himself there. Since the Haji Sahab had arrived, the local people had paid great reverence to him and they felt the mullahs they were let down. So they started a slander campaign against Haji Sahab behind his back. They said, what has he come here for? To wage war against the British or to feather his own nest? The Haji Sahab and his son Badshah Gul were very upset by all this talk, and Haji Sahab wanted to start the war there. And then I strongly advised him against it. These people are selfish, I told him. Don't take any notice of what they say. Just carry on with your work. As for starting a war, the people are not yet ready to face the British. If you start a war now, you will find that they are incompetent and useless. I had the feeling that the mullahs wanted to hand you over to the British. But Haji Sahab did not heed my advice, and a few days after I left, he did start a fight against the British. But how could he wage a war against the British in Bonair? My warning proved to be correct. An effort was made to capture him and hand him over to the British. Fortunately, the Haji Sahab found out about the plot in time and managed to get away. He left at midnight for Mohand. The British did not want the Pathans to be educated. In fact, they did not like our national schools at all, and they had been looking for an excuse or an opportunity to close them down. Now they had both. Not only in Bonair, but in the whole of our province, the schools were closed down and all the teachers were arrested and taken to the habitual jail in Dera Ismail Khan. The British so much frightened our people that hardly anybody had the courage to speak about our country in terms of admiration or praise. And on the very rare occasion that somebody did, he was almost certain to be put into the prison. Bereavement and imprisonment. In December of 1915, my second son Wali was born. My eldest son Ghani was about 3 years old then. After the First World War, an epidemic of influenza raged all over India. My children lost their mother in this epidemic. It happened in a very strange way. She was in perfect health, but my son Ghani had been struck down by the epidemic and had been seriously ill. He was unconscious and we had given up hope of his recovery. It was the time of the evening prayer and I was sitting on my prayer mat. I had just finished my namaz and was praying for God's blessings. My son was lying on a cot in front of me. His mother came into the room and walked around the cot. Then she stood at the head of the bed. Tears were streaming down her face as she raised her hands towards the heaven and humbly began to pray. O Lord, take this illness away from my innocent child and let me suffer in his place. Make him well, O Lord, and let me be ill instead of him. And behold, how wonderful are the ways of the Almighty. We passed the night somehow. In the morning, Ghani had slowly begun to recover, but his mother became ill. When Ghani finally recovered, his mother passed away. When in 1918 the First World War came to an end, everyone breathed a sigh of relief, but our troubles were by no means over. In 1919, the agitation over the Rowlatt Act began, and I also took part in it. A protest meeting against the Rowlatt Act, which was held in our village, was attended by over 100,000 people. The meeting put a new hope in the hearts of the Pathans. One day, a protest meeting was to be held at Tahikhal, a locality near Islamia College, Peshawar, and I was on my way to attend the meeting when I learned that martial law had been declared. The reason was that the British had started the war with Afghanistan, and the king of Afghanistan was known to be sympathetic towards the Indian freedom movement. To escape the martial law, which made us rather nervous, I and a few of my companions left for Mohmand, from where we intended to go to Afghanistan. When we arrived at Mohmand, after an arduous journey, I found that my father had followed us. He forbade us to go to Afghanistan and instead took us to his agricultural farm at Mohammad Nari, where we remained in hiding. We visited our homes only at night. The police, however, found out where we were and they came and arrested me. They took me to Mardan and put me in prison. The following day, I was brought before the superintendent of the police, who gave orders to put me in fetters. But when they took me back, they found that there were no fetters large enough for my feet. But the prison authorities were too afraid of the British not to obey the order. So they forced my feet into a pair of fetters that were too small for me and put me in a motor car. Accompanied by the superintendent of the police and the assistant commissioner of Mardan, I was taken to Peshawar. There I was produced before the chief superintendent of the police and then taken to the cantonment lockup for the night. The fetters they had put on me were so tight that I could hardly walk. The skin was rubbed off my feet and they were bleeding. The next morning, a police inspector, an Afridi, came to my cell and said, "Come along, you have to appear before the court." I said, "My feet are hurting, I can't walk." This annoyed him and he shouted, "You were able to walk on to your meeting all right, weren't you? But now you can't walk to the court." I realized it was no use arguing with him, so I finally said, "I will not be able to walk. If you bring a tanga, I'll go with you, but I cannot go on foot." Then the inspector brought a tanga and I was taken to the court. I was told to sit outside the courtroom and wait for my turn, as another prisoner was being dealt with just then. This was a man from my village. He had cut some telegraph wires, and for this crime, he had been sentenced to 2 years imprisonment. He had been brought to the court that day with a special purpose. He had been asked to give evidence that he had cut the telegraph wires at my instigation, and as a reward for giving this fabricated evidence, he had been promised remission of his 2 year sentence. But the man has refused to oblige. When I was taken into the courtroom, there were 3 Britishers in the court instead of the customary one. They began to interrogate me, but what could I reply? All I had done at the meeting was to agree with all the resolutions that were adopted. One of the Britishers asked me, "Is it not true that you consort with your people who are against the government?" I replied, "The people I move about with are all your own loyal Khans and Maliks." When the questions were over, they sent me out while they decided what to do with me. Actually, the then Chief Commissioner, Sir George Roos Keppel, had a great liking and sympathy for the Pathans. Because he was the chief administrator of the martial law, he had the power to restrict suppression to a minimum. After an hour's waiting, I was taken back to the prison and put in the same barracks where many other Pathans were kept. One day, quite unexpectedly, and to my great surprise, my feeble old father, accompanied by some friends and relatives, arrived. He was extremely happy to find me alive, for he had heard rumors that I had been hanged. My father told me that army troops had gone to Usmanzai and surrounded the villages. They had collected all the villagers in the school compound and told them to sit down. Then they mounted the guns they had brought and made a great show of loading them. The people naturally thought they were all going to be blown up and they began to say their prayers. However, not a shot was fired, but the people had all been frightened to death, and that had been the sole aim and purpose of this British trick. The troops had also looted the village, and one Britisher had taken away a hunting knife from our home. The deputy commissioner imposed a collective fine of rupees 30,000 on the villagers. Several of the Khans in my villages had in my village had already been sent to prison. But there was one Khan, Muhammad Umar Khan, who was working hand in glove with the British government and the police. Now, both the police and Muhammad Umar Khan tyrannized the people till they had collected over 100,000 rupees, and they kept 150 people hostages till the last rupee was paid. And even after the fine had been collected, they kept 100 men in prison. At that time, the police were making a tremendous effort to prove that I was connected with the disturbances in Afghanistan. They had even briefed a man called Ahmad Ustad to give evidence against me, but they did not succeed because Sir George Roos Capel did not want to start a case against me. My prison sentence came to an end after 6 months. I can endure personal misfortune and difficulties and face them bravely. But all these events did great harm to my people because from now on the Pathans were deeply involved in politics. I have until now experienced martial law twice. The first time was in 1919 and when it was imposed by the British. The second time was in 1958 after Pakistan had been created. Let us take a brief look at both the martial laws and how they were administered so that we may get an idea of the different methods employed by these two governments. When the British martial law was imposed, they were on the one hand involved in the war in Afghanistan, and on the other hand, they had to deal with the growing disturbances and the agitations in our country. To ensure peace and quiet and smooth running of their administration, the British could see no other way but to impose martial law, but it was imposed for only 2 or 3 months. In Pakistan, there was peace and quiet. The administration, judiciary, and public order were running normally when suddenly martial law was imposed. The purpose was to force upon the country a government of a few individuals to deprive the people of their democratic rights and to obstruct elections. The country was under martial law for 4 years. Judging by the results, the two martial laws had one specific and important point in common. The British martial law made it clear that to the Indian people that the time had come to throw off the yoke of foreign rule. So they intensified their struggle for freedom, and in the end, the British had to give us our independence and leave the country. In Pakistan, too, the martial law has made people aware that their government was not a representative government, but it was imposed upon them by tyranny and oppression. The British could not permanently establish their rule by the use of force and suppression, and neither will the Pakistani rulers be able to do so. Their rule will come to an end one day, like the British rule came to an end. Were we arrested? When I came out of prison, I noticed a new zeal and fervor in the people. Wherever people gathered, whether for celebrations or sorrow, the conversation always focused on the country and the people. They no longer lived in fear. There was a new awakening and enthusiasm. The Khilafat movement had also started with great force and clamor. The Indians as a people have a peculiar tendency to take a greater interest in other countries than their own. If the Indian Muslims had taken as much interest in their own national movement as they took in the Khilafat movement, they would not have lagged behind the other communities of the world. On the other hand, the Khilafat movement also did the Indian Muslims a great deal of good, for it made them more organized. Not only in the towns but also in the villages, Khilafat centers were founded. The only regrettable thing was that they could not keep their organization going. People had not yet learned how to run their organizations and how to make them strong and firm. And as long as people have not learned that, no country can hope to create and maintain any kind of order. The question arises how people can be taught this. I think two things are essential. In the first place, people must have the right faith and a strong belief that they are going the right way. Secondly, they need the right kind of leaders to guide them and to carry the torch of their faith, their religion, and their ideals. God has sent many great messengers into this world, and India has been specially blessed by his bounty. But remember, if there were not the band of good, holy and selfless people who, for the love of God and His messenger, devoted themselves to service, the messenger could not have carried out his mission successfully. Religion is also a movement. If selfless, undemanding, and holy men and women join this movement and dedicate themselves to the service of their country and their people, this movement is bound to be successful. Such people will be a blessing to mankind. Through their contribution, their country and their people will flourish and prosper. When I came out of prison, my parents, who had wanted me to marry again, had arranged my betrothal, and the marriage was to take place soon. With a friend of mine, Abbas Khan, I left for Peshawar to do some shopping. When we reached Sardar Yab, the police were waiting for us by the bridge. They arrested both of us and took us back to the police station at Charsadda. But from there, our case was referred to Peshawar. In Peshawar, we were taken straight to the bungalow of Mr. Short, the chief CID officer. We were made to stand on the road outside the bungalow while the police officer who had accompanied us went in to report our arrival. The evening we were still standing there. It was December and therefore very cold. Mr. Short was sitting comfortably by the fire, but he had left us standing outside in the cold night. My friend Abbas Khan asked me, "Why are we arrested? What have we done? And what shall we say when we appear before the officer?" I said, "Answer every question truthfully. Be careful, but do not tell lies." It was late in the night when at last Abbas's name was called out and he was taken inside. Then I was also brought before Mr. Short. Mr. Short was notorious for being a very harsh man. It appeared that there had been a bomb incident in Nowshera, and it was in this connection that Abbas and I had been arrested. Mr. Short began to ask me questions and I replied loudly and clearly. "Speak softly," shouted Mr. Short. So I gave my next reply in a soft and gentle voice. "Speak up," shouted Mr. Short. I said, "When I speak loudly, you ask me to speak softly, and when I do, you want me to speak up. Would you kindly tell me exactly in what manner you wish me to address you?" I could see that this made him very angry, but he did not say anything to me. He only called the policeman and handed me over to him. The policeman took me away and put me in lockup at Sadar police station. Nobody thought of giving me anything to eat, and I spent a hungry night there. Abbas Khan had been put in a lockup at another police station. The night was very cold, and so was the cement floor of the cell. The door was bare. Some stinking, half-rotten, lice-ridden blankets were lying on the floor. It made me sick just to look at them, but it was bitterly cold. I had no alternative but to cover myself with those dirty rags. When I woke up in the morning, my clothes were full of lice. I sighed and began to pick them off one by one. I was kept in this cell for a week, and then I was taken to Mr. Short again, who then gave orders for my release. I asked him, "May I know why I was arrested and why I was kept here for a week?" He said, "I was making enquiries." I asked again, "Could you not have made enquiries before you had arrested me?" He replied, "It is entirely up to me whether to make enquiries first or to make the arrest first." I said, "But I am a human being after all. Did you not think of my position? There was no reason to put me through all this inconvenience. I wasn't going to run away. If your inquiries had proved me guilty, you could have easily arrested me." "What do you mean by your position?" he said harshly. I simply said, "Very well," and left the room. Then I returned to my village. Hijrat campaign. My second marriage took place in 1920. In that year, I also took part in the All India Khilafat Committee conference in Delhi. There was at the conference an ardent young man called Aziz who proposed the Hijrat movement. Hijrat means exodus or immigration. He said that we should all leave this country. At that time, we thought it was just a joke, but the joke became a calamity. This unfortunate joke was the cause of a terrible loss of Pathan lives and property. Hijrat committee was formed and Peshawar, and anyone who wanted to migrate to Afghanistan had to go through this committee, which provided them with all kinds of facilities and comforts. In the beginning, the British tried to stop people from going on the hijrat to Afghanistan, but later, when they found out that people would not listen to them, they changed their tune and encouraged the people to go on hijrat in large numbers. They thought they could kill two birds with one stone. Afghanistan would be put to a great deal of trouble having to cope with the immigrants, and as the political workers from the rest of India might also go on hijrat, they would get rid of them and their worries would be over. The British also sent a number of trained spies with the immigrants to Afghanistan. Mullahs issued a forcible fatwa saying any man who does not go on hijrat will have to divorce his wife. But the woman had different ideas. It is said that the doe is so swift footed that even if one made her wear ankle bells, she would be out of sight before anybody could see who she was or where she was going. Many women became as swift footed as the doe when it was a question of staying with their husbands. I myself went on the hijrat and I saw the whole show with my own eyes. Amanullah Khan wanted to give the immigrants land and employment and a share in trade too, but the spies the British sent with the immigrants were against it. They said, "We have not come here to take land or to seek employment or to set up ourselves in business. We have come here to wage a holy war." King Amanullah said, "I have not enough strength to fight the British. I shall give you a colony here if you amongst yourself can build up enough strength to wage a war against the British. I shall give you all the help I can. You know as well as I do that the British are like a black cobra that will not let you live in peace, and I, for one, live in constant fear of its deadly bite." But the spies moved among the exiles and did their shameful work. There was another group in Kabul too who were against the Hijrat and who secretly did all they could to turn it into a failure. And though King Amanullah tried to help the immigrants, all his efforts were in vain and the Hijrat movement had to admit defeat. While I was in Kabul, I had an audience with the King Amanullah. The king could speak several languages, but he did not know Pashto. During the audience, I said to him, "There is something I would like to say, if you will allow me." The king said, "Of course." I said, "What a pity it is that you, who know so many languages, do not know Pashto, though it is your mother tongue and your national language." The king agreed with me, and soon he began to learn Pashto. At that time, Nadir Khan was the Minister of Defense and Sardar Ubaidullah Gharis Khan, the father of Sardar Daud Khan, was the Minister of Education. I knew both of them very well. Sardar Ubaidullah Gharis Khan said to me one day, "I am going to visit Habibia College." I decided to accompany him. The principal of the college very kindly allowed me to visit some of the classes and ask students questions. I had to speak to them in Persian. "Who are you?" I asked one of the students. "I am an Afghan." I asked, "What country do you belong to?" "Afghanistan," he replied. "What is your national language?" I asked again. The answer was Afghani. "Do you know this language?" The reply came shyly, "No." Then the boy lowered his eyes and kept quiet. "Say something, sir," I urged, but the boy said, "I can't." Then I said, "You call yourself a good Afghan and you can't even speak your own language." Muhammad Tarzi was the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Afghanistan, an extremely able and competent man. One day he invited me to a party. During the evening, the language question came up, and this gave Muhammad Tarzi the opportunity to say, "Our people speak Persian as well as Pashto." I remarked, "But Pashto is the national language of Afghanistan." I am not saying that nobody should speak Persian, but what I want to know is why you people have forgotten your own language. It is, after all, the language of the majority. When the British came to India, they did not know any of the languages that were spoken in this country. Neither did anybody in India understand their language. Yet they did not make any Indian language the official language. Their own language remained the language of the government. The result was that the millions of people learnt English. People from different parts of India cannot understand each other's language, but English has penetrated everywhere, and there is hardly any part of India where you cannot make yourself understood in English. If you you had made Afghani your national language, it would have been spoken by everyone today. Eventually, all the people from our province who had gone on hijrat to Afghanistan returned home. Some of my friends went to Tashkent, and I myself, with a few companions, went to Bajor, where we wanted to establish schools for the independent tribes. One of the schools we opened was in Khalu, a village in the district of Dir. Maulvi Fazal Muhammad Sahib Makhfi was put in charge of the school. The people of this village were very pleased because they were very keen on education and their children were unusually intelligent. This was the first opportunity they had of going to school and they took full advantage of it. Political agent of Malakand, an Englishman called Cab, was very hostile towards the Pathan movement for education and he opposed it whenever and wherever he could. When he found that the school in Khalu was so popular with the villagers, he sent for the Nawab of Dir. Look here, he told him, all this education is creating endless trouble for us. If you want to avoid getting yourself into difficulties, you better see that the school is destroyed as soon as possible. So the Nawab had the school demolished. These were the conditions under which we had to work, the hardships we had to face. I was all alone now. All my companions and colleagues had left Bajor district. I made a tour of both Dir and Bajor districts and then went back home. I thought I should now try to reopen the schools which the British had closed down during the First World War. These were the days when the Khilafat movement and the Congress were meeting on a common platform. My friend Qazi Ataullah and I had received invitations for a function at Aligarh University. As we were going there, it occurred to me that I should also attend the meeting of the Khilafat movement. At Aligarh University, we found a number of students from our province. We talked and exchanged views with them. Several of them had given up going to college because of their pro-Turkish sentiment. Because of urgent business elsewhere, the Qazi Sahab and I could not attend Khilafat conference after all, and we went back to Usmanzai. At the end of December of 1920, my brother, Dr. Khan Sahib, returned from England where he had spent about 15 years. He had finished his medical studies during the war and had been enlisted in the army as a doctor. He had the rank of captain and was attached to the Guides of Mardan. With the help of some friends, I had been trying to provide facilities for higher education. In 1921, our efforts were crowned with the success and the Azad High School was founded in Usmanzai. My colleagues at this school were Qazi Sahab Ataullah, Mia Ahmad Shah, Haji Abdul Ghaffar Khan, Haji Muhammad Abbas Khan, Abdullah Akbar Khan, Taj Muhammad Khan, Abdullah Shah, and Khadim Muhammad Akbar Khan. We also founded a society which we called Anjaman al-Afghani. We were short of teachers for our school. One reason was that we could not afford to pay our teachers very high salaries. So I also used to take classes. During that period, I attended a conference of the Khilafat movement at Lahore. At the conference, I met Aziz Mukhtar Khan from Mirakhel village in Bannu district. He was accompanied by his two sons, Aziz Mumtaz Khan and Maqsood Khan, who were both studying for their BA degrees at Islamia College, Peshawar, but had stopped going to college during the pro-Turkish movement like the students we had met in Aligarh. Aziz Mukhtar Khan gave both his sons to our school. Maqsood became the first headmaster and later when he went back to college to continue his interrupted studies, his brother Aziz Mumtaz Khan took over from him. The British did not like our school and whenever we appointed new teachers, they tried to frighten and threaten them. If that did not scare them away, they tried to lure them away by offering them better paid jobs. Poor Maqsood Khan too was harassed by the police whenever he came to Usmanzai. Khilafat movement. I was still enthusiastic about the Khilafat movement, but that path did not run smoothly either. The Khilafat movement in Peshawar had split up into two different parties. One day, Haji Jan Muhammad Sahib and his colleagues organized a public meeting in the Shahi Bagh. At that meeting, it was proposed that Haji Jan Muhammad Sahib should be elected the president of the Khilafat committee. The proposal was unanimously accepted. The following day, a certain Sayyid Sahib Sahib and his friends gathered in Peshawar and held a meeting of their own. They said that Sayyid Sahib was the true follower of the Prophet and a servant of the people. Therefore, his claim was greater than Haji Jan Muhammad Sahib's, and he should be elected the president of Khilafat Committee. And all the people in the meeting shouted, agreed. These were the conditions under which the Khilafat movement had to work. The agitation and the rivalry increased day by day. No real work was done. Precious time was being wasted. There was no harmony among the workers. Normally, the people of Peshawar are good, hard-working folk, but the disharmony amongst themselves made them useless as workers for the movement. I used to go to the Khilafat office once in a while, and as I was on friendly terms with both the parties, they both used to talk to me about their differences. Both parties made it quite clear that they had confidence in me, and eventually it was suggested that I take over as the presidentship. I was not really interested because I am not, on the whole, a lover of presidentships or other high offices, and I prefer to keep away from them. But in this case, I felt that I had to accept it. I made one condition, however. I stipulated that all the subscriptions collected in the frontier province should be spent solely on education within the province. And so I became the president of the Khilafat Committee with Abdul Qayyum as my secretary. Now that I had Now that I did not have to worry about the school as much, I began to tour the tribal districts. My purpose was first of all to meet the people and to exchange thoughts and ideas with them, and secondly to see if I could reopen the old schools in the tribal areas. It was about 6 months after my school at Usmanzai had been opened that the chief commissioner for our district sent for my father and said to him, I have noticed that your son is touring the villages and opening schools. I have also noticed that other people stay quietly at home and don't bother about these things. Would you kindly ask your son to give up all these activities and stay at home like other people? When my father came home and told me in private what the commissioner had said, and he added, Why don't you stay comfortably at home, son? Why should you do all these things that nobody else bothers about? My father's rebuke, gentle though it was, upset me. I said to him, These British don't hesitate to sow discord between fathers and sons if it serves them their purpose. My father was deeply religious man. I said to him, Father, if everybody else stopped saying their namaz, would you advise me to do the same? My father replied, God forbid, saying namaz is a sacred duty. I said, and to my mind, educating the people and serving the nation is as sacred a duty as namaz. Very seriously, my father replied, Son, if it is so sacred a duty, you must never give it up. My father told the commissioner that we could not possibly give up our religion and our sacred duties for his sake. A few days later, I was arrested and was asked to furnish security, which I refused. On the 11th of December 1921, I was sentenced to 3 years rigorous imprisonment under Section 4 of the Frontier Crime Regulation. It was certainly rigorous imprisonment. The food we were given did not deserve its name, and the clothes we were supposed to wear could hardly be called clothes. A father and his son from my village were brought in at the same time. When they had changed into their prison clothes, the boy could not recognize his father anymore. He began to cry, Baba, Baba, where are you? The father said, Son, I am here, right beside you. And what about a tall, robust man like me? Of the prison clothes they gave me, the trousers did not even come down to my calves. And they were so tight that they tore at the seams. The shirt stopped above my waist. A new prisoner was usually put in solitary confinement, and he was required to grind 20 seers of corn every day. He was put in fetters, and an iron collar was put around his neck from which hung a small identity disc showing the prisoner's crime and the duration of his sentence. The warder in this prison was a Hindu. He was an honest man, and as he was a patriot, he was sympathetic to the jail inmates, though he put me in the the solitary cell. He did not put me in fetters nor made me grind corn. He gave me prison food, but the chapatis were clean and the dal and the vegetables were at least eatable. My cell was bitterly cold because it faced the north and never got any sun. I was given three blankets and a piece of granny sacking. They were no protection against the cold. Besides, we never left our cells, and getting no exercise made me feel even colder. Occasionally, when a kind guard happened to be on duty, I was allowed to sit outside in the sun for half an hour or so. Another difficulty was that even at night, nobody was allowed to sleep in peace because every 3 hours the guards changed, and the one who came on duty had to knock at every door and call out till the occupant of the cell answered. The prisoner who did not reply was punished the next day. When I was arrested, I was the first to sent to Peshawar prison. I was not put in a lockup as is usual when one is awaiting sentence, but I was put in the criminal cell. When the door was opened, a most odious smell met my nostrils. The source of it was not difficult to trace. A clay chamber pot full of the last occupant's excrements was lying in the corner. I told the prison officer that I could not stay in such a dirty cell, but he said coldly, "You are in prison, you know," and pushed me inside. After I was put in prison, my friends in the Khilafat movement were also arrested and sent to prison. We were kept locked day and night. Our food was shoved in through a barred opening in the door. The door was opened only when the sweeper came to clean the cell. The cells were closely guarded lest anyone should try to come near us or talk to us. The result of this cruel treatment was that most of my colleagues decided to furnish security, but Abdul Qayyum and I refused to do that. After 10 days, I was taken to the deputy commissioner. He was a queer Englishman, and his method was equally odd. He asked the policeman who had brought me what offense I had committed. The policeman told him that I had gone on Hijrat and also opened an Azad school. The deputy commissioner asked him, "Why did you allow him to return to this country once he had gone on Hijrat?" Now I spoke up and said, "First, you have taken our country from us, and now you won't even let us live in it anymore." This made the Englishman very angry, and he told the policeman, "Take him out of my sight. I am sentencing him to 3 years imprisonment." The policeman took me back to the prison. Abdul Qayyum was also given 3 years sentence. It was an offense for any prisoner to keep food in his cell. One day I was sitting in my solitary cell when a man from my village who was also a prisoner came to my cell and gave me 2 pieces of gur. Gur is jaggery. Hide it under my blankets, but suppose the jailer wanted to inspect my bed under the gunny sacking then. Where could one hide anything in this bare cell? Somehow or the other I managed, and as luck would have it, though the jailer did come in, he did not search anything. When he had gone, I threw the pieces of wood out of the window, and there and then I made the resolution that as long as I was in jail, I would never do anything against the rules and regulations because it created fear in the man's heart. I had seen it happen to many of my political friends. First, they violate the rules, then they flatter the jailer. They have to even bribe him. All this is caused by fear, and it costs a man his self respect. I did not want that to happen to me. Some time later, my brother, Dr. Khan Sahib, and a few others came to see me. They brought a message from the government. The message said that I would be allowed to run the schools, but I must stop touring the villages. If I agreed to that, the message went on, I would be released from the prison. I tore up the government's message. Among the many other prisoners in this jail were some crusaders from Chamarkand, whom I knew. For when I was going from Kabul to Bajor, I had gone to Chamarkand to meet them. I had tried to advise them and to help them. I had warned them not to go to the frontier or Punjab because of their men had been arrested there. And how much longer, I asked them, will you people go on chasing a dream? Why don't you start looking for jobs? You have mules, haven't you? Well, not very far from here, in Kunar district, a large variety of fruit is grown. If you go there and buy fruit and sell it in Mohmand district, you will be able to make a decent living and you will be independent and free. I gave them this advice because when I was in their district, I had studied their circumstances and their way of living. I had found that they were becoming useless and idle. These crusaders had come to Chamarkand from Bonaire. Disunity had crept into their ranks and they had killed their leader, a Punjabi. Splitting up into factions and engaging in fights and brawls seems to come naturally to our Punjabi brothers. There were also a number of Bengalis among the Crusaders in Bonaire, and they lived together in friendship and love. But as soon as Punjabis joined them, they formed themselves into different groups, and the fights and the brawls started. In the end, the commander had been killed, and they had all been told to leave Bonaire. It was then they had gone to Chamarkand, but the party spirit was still there. Their leader, Maulvi Fazal Ali, was a great groupist and a very dangerous man. I had met him when I was about to leave Kabul and I had given him a great deal of advice. Because of this party factionism, Maulvi Fazal Ali had killed a very good leader, Maulvi Bakshi, who was a most virtuous and sincere worker. Even in prison, these crusaders were in a bad state. They used to quarrel and beat each other up. After my arrival, the situation improved. They told me that one of their colleagues back home was a Hafiz of Quran. A Hafiz of Quran is the one who knows the Quran by heart. He was actually working for the police. He used to report against good workers to the police while he himself stayed in the background. Then he would tell this worker, let's go to such and such a place. We'll be able to collect good subscriptions there. The worker would go with him in good faith, and by the time he discovered that he had been deceived, it was too late for then the police would be waiting for him and he would be taken in. They also told me that this Hafiz-e-Quran had gone to Chamarkand again in search of new victims. It appeared that he had his eye on one of our most distinguished leaders. Somehow or the other, they said, word should be sent to Chamarkand warning everybody not on any account to go anywhere with this Hafiz-e-Quran. One of the imprisoned crusaders was a Mohmand. He was due to be released in a day or so. His home was near Chamarkand. The crusaders wanted me to write a letter warning their colleagues at home against this Hafiz-e-Quran. The Mohmand was to deliver the letter. At first, I was not inclined to write such a letter, but when I thought of the trouble this Hafiz-e-Quran was causing and the harm he was doing to the crusaders, I changed my mind and wrote a brief letter which I gave to the Mohmand the day before his release. In this prison, ordinary prisoners were usually kept in those solitary cells for a week, but they kept me in one for 2 months. Then I was transferred to Dera Ismail Khan, meant for the habitual prisoners.